Good things come to those who wait. Better late than never. However you want to spice it up, we are finally here, ready to rock and roll. We are just a week or so away from training camp. Rookies reported today. There is plenty to talk about. You know, we're going to talk about the quarterback position because we are about to find out what's really going to go down. So I got my guy Vish. We're going to talk about a lot, and we're going to do it all in just a second. All right. Welcome back to Last Second Sports, where we are giving you our take down to the last second. And it's Tuesday. In Sunil's absence, I got my guy, Vish. What's going on, Vish? Glad to see you finally make an appearance after about 20 minutes of technical difficulties.
Yeah. We had some technical difficulties, right? I just moved. I originally had my background, blurred, and I wanted to show off the snazzy new background, no longer the white color. I got some great paint here in my new room. And so I wanted to show that off, and we were having some technical issues, but we're here now. We're ready to go. I got a tough person to replace here in Sunil, but I'm going to do my best. And I'm really excited to talk to you.
Well, I think the wait was well worth it. Seeing a non-white basic background. I do see you've got your water bottle, which is good to see.
I'm ready
Very
to go.
important.
I'm prepared.
You cannot get parched during a live stream. And it seems like whenever Vish and I go live, we set time for about an hour. We put together the normal topics. We end up getting to maybe half the topics, and we go for about 2 hours. So I would imagine, although you had to wait a while, that you're going to get plenty of content here today with Vish and myself. So don't worry about that. But let's start with a video that I posted yesterday. And I know that you watched it. You also probably went back and just watched the whole interview. But essentially, there was an insider who works with quarterbacks, works with wide receivers, and really actually spends a lot of time with Patrick Mahomes and Dak Prescott in particular, and Jeff Christensen. And he talked about how Trey Lance is looking different, much improved after 40 plus days with Mr. Christensen. And this is not any different than what we've been hearing from Shanahan, from Lynch, from the players. What are your thoughts overall about this? Do you think it's a bunch of fluff? Do you think they're trying to prop up trade value? Do you think it's legitimate? Where do you sit on all this Trey Lance? It seems like a 180 really over the last couple months.
I think the truth is somewhere in between all of those things. I think some of it is fluff. I think some of it is genuine, like, hey, the guy has made tremendous strides this offseason. I mean, the one thing you can always say about him is that he's willing to put in the work over the course of the offseason. It seems like he's done that. I thought the cooler thing about this compliment compared to other ones was that this one was unprovoked, right? It was almost like a commercial for Jeff Christensen, but in giving Jeff Christensen the commercial, it was like, hey, Trey Lance has also improved tremendously. And so when you're hearing stuff like that unprovoked, you got to be like, yeah, perhaps, the guy has really improved this offseason. But I do think some of the 180 with it and some of the way things have turned, the timing of, John Lynch just 2 months ago was saying, hey, I don't want to say it, but like, yeah, we are open to having trade talks and Trey is aware and all of that. And now, like, you got Kyle Juszczyk going on with Haberman and Middlecoff. Shout out to them and being like, hey, guy, like, that was terrible take, all of that. Like, well, I mean, I perhaps Haberman and Middlecoff get a certain perception when a guy says, hey, this is the return to 49ers football after another guy gets hurt. So I take everything for what it's worth. I think that he's probably improved a lot. But I also think that there is some level of, hey, we have done a terrible job of creating a positive public perception of this guy. We need to do a better job. And I feel like most guys are becoming more cognizant of what they say about him in the media. And you can see that.
Do you think that this is do you think it's a conscious effort by everybody to go out of their way? Much like last year, we heard that Shanahan kind of galvanized a group of players, the leadership grew of the team, and was like, hey, make sure you're saying only good things about Trey Lance.
Mhm.
Do you think it's one of those situations where he's doing that again? Or do you think it's everybody's just kind of falling in line naturally? Like, how do you think it's all coming about?
I think it could be some of that, but that doesn't exactly mean, hey, Trey Lance hasn't put in work and actually improved, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, I think the 180 and how they're talking about that, like that to me, it doesn't happen in just, hey, we see him in minicamp. Usually, this kind of 180, like, sure, you see the guy putting in the work, but you have to see him through training camp, right? So I do think the 180 is a little too sharp of a turn for me to not put my tinfoil hat on and say, well, hey, you're really gassing the guy up. But at the same time, just because you're gassing him up doesn't mean that the guy also hasn't improved tremendously. I just find sometimes the commentary to be rather patronizing when George Kittle is like, hey, I'm not going to lie to you guys. He's way better than he was last year. Well, it's like, I never thought he was that bad in the little time we got to see him last year. And
Right.
it's almost as if you're saying, well, last year we lied to you and told you, but he actually sucked. But this year, guys, this year, we got the real trick for you. I find it a little bit patronizing and a little bit excessive in how they talk about him at times with stuff like that.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting. And, I didn't even have it as a topic, but you brought it up, the whole use check with Haberman and Middlecoff. That was,
Right.
he's the one that put the flame on. He's the
Right.
one that turned the flame on, and now he's trying to put the flame out. And yeah, it does look weird, use check, when you've got a group of guys consistently going to games together and Trey's not a part of that group. Of course, people are going to
Yeah,
draw
of course,
conclusions. What do
yeah.
you think's going to happen? Come on, man.
And I think the reason, by the way, I think the reason the click is even relevant because I think on any team you have cliques of guys that go
For
out
sure.
right together. I think the reason the click is kind of relevant on this team is because the click seems to be every good player, right? Like the elite players seem to be a click together. And I think that's why we actually care about the click, right? If the click was the combination that it was in 2017, where you had rookie George Kittle, rookie Trent Taylor, veteran Pro Bowl, all pro Kyle Juszczyk, and highly paid Jimmy Garoppolo, I don't think many people are that bothered by that click. But when you have pretty much every prominent player on the team, together and going to these kinds of things, it does create a certain impression in fans' minds, whether it's true or not.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Brother Bob says maybe a 180 because they know Purdy won't start. Pig in a pickle. You gotta
Oh, I
love a
love
pig in a pickle
I
reference.
love how he does it with the emojis too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you got to get crafty. And it's funny because, I'll do shows with Grant, and that's where you get most of the donations are on a big show like his. And
Right.
so a lot of $2 donos come in, and they only have a limited character space. So they got to get real crafty, and they'll try to like do one word references, and you're like, I don't know what you're trying to say. I'm so confused. Then they end up paying $2 more just to clarify what they meant the first time. It's like, just pay the $5 and say what you're going to say, I guess, especially on Grant's, because you're only going to get your super chats read. That chat goes way too fast to keep up with anything else.
The chat is its own show.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
big. Okay, Shay, that's pause.
Okay.
Very, very disturbing.
I'll take the compliment, but okay.
Oh man, I absolutely love it. Okay. Let's talk about Brock Purdy a little bit. And what made me think about Brock Purdy was recently the NFL top 10 quarterback list came out. And the assumption is that Brock Purdy's going to start week 1. Assuming he's healthy, I think we all agree that he's going to get the nod. So in the thought that we want to have a franchise quarterback and we hope that that guy is on this roster, let's assume it's the guy that they start day 1. That would be Brock Purdy. What can he do to be a top 10 quarterback? And I'll give you the list real quick. This list was from ESPN. It's a list that coaches,
is
GMs.
it the Jeremy Fowler voted list?
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm pretty sure it's that list where like GMs and coaches vote on it or whatever.
Right.
So the list was Mahomes, Burrow, Allen, Rodgers, Herbert, Hurts, Lamar, Lawrence, Dak, and Stafford. That was the top 10. First of all, how do you feel about that top 10? Is that something you agree with? And then how does one Brock Purdy crack that list? What does he need to do?
So I think the top 8 are pretty standard for everybody. You can argue the order, but I think most people have some combination of Mahomes, Burrow, Allen, Aaron Rodgers, Justin Herbert, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Trevor Lawrence as, the top 8 quarterbacks in the league.
Yep.
Then when you get to 9 to 10, I like Dak. I'm higher on Dak than, the average Dak opiner. I see Grant has, been very negative on Dak of recent. So I now know how 49ers fans feel about Dak, and they don't really like Dak, but I think Dak's a good player. I'd probably put Dak there. And then, I'm never going to say no to Matthew Stafford being on the precipice of the top 10, but it's like, there's a few guys you can go right there, right? Like if you want to go with who was there in the past, it was Stafford. Kyler Murray, just 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was in that conversation at 9, 10, right? Deshaun Watson, the last couple weeks, like I know I'm not rooting for the guy, but the talent is still there, right? And then Geno, how do you rate Geno? Last year's season would put him in that conversation, right? So you have him around there. You have Kirk Cousins.
They didn't even have him as an honorable mention. The honorable mentions they had were Watson's, Cousins, Goff, Carr, and Tua.
Right. The Goff one.
Yeah.
God, I don't get the Goff one. But okay, even Tua I can understand a little bit more than Goff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I believe I like that list, honestly, overall, if you go through it. I think 9 through 10 is kind of shady for everybody because it's like, do you go off pass? If you go off pass, you're probably going to think Stafford or Dak or Kirk Cousins right there. If you're going off of who had the 9 and 10 season last year, I think Geno would probably get one of those spots. And then who would you put around there as well? So I think that it's really how you rank them. But you know what I noticed, Jesse, as we just talked through it and as we're getting to Brock Purdy here, we put a ranking of 10 different quarterbacks, right? But really, I think we feel that there's only 8 top 10 quarterbacks because there were 8 guys that both of us were like, okay, yeah, those 8 guys are in for sure. And then the other 2 spots were, hey, it's open to your discretion based on what you want to take into account on how you want to value, 8 different quarterbacks that we just named as honorable mentions.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, every year there's 7, sometimes 8 guys that are kind of bona fide top 10 quarterbacks. And right now, a couple guys on the list in Lawrence and Hurts, I mean, they're 1-year guys. They're ascending. Right. We think that they're probably going to stay there, but there could be a backslide from either one of them as well. So they may not even be necessarily mainstays either. Really, the guys that are like for sure's that I would be shocked, something crazy would have to happen for them not to be there next year would be Mahomes, Burrow, Allen, Rodgers may retire, I guess, Herbert, and Lamar likely, right? So it's a core group of guys. And then, Kyler Murray a couple years ago was in this list. Watson was on this list.
Right.
Russell
Derek
Wilson
Carr just a year ago was right on the precipice, right? Ryan Tannehill was somebody we put in very near the conversation. Now we're like talking like Daniel Jones, right?
Yeah,
Daniel Jones could make an argument here. That's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you could be a top 10 quarterback for a season, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be a mainstay there. I mean, Watson was actually, I don't care what anybody says. I went back and forth with somebody the other day about this. Deshaun Watson for a 3-year span was a top 5 quarterback in this league.
Oh, 100%.
He just was.
Absolutely.
So,
there's no argument.
I could see him easily getting back on this list. I could see Russell Wilson regaining some of the things that he had and getting back on this list. So
Bryce Young's coming, CJ Stroud's coming.
Yep. So I guess the question begs, what does Brock Purdy have to do to get on this list? And I saw some people, let me see if I can find this one again. This was a good one. It was just pure stats. Here we go. Mike Drops with Monza says 72%, 4,000 yards, 40 touchdowns, 13 or less interceptions. Do you think it's that simple? Do you think he just needs to put up stats like that? Or is there something more or less that can be done to make top 10 in your opinion?
It's not about the stats, right? Nobody ever puts Kirk Cousins there. If we take a
Yeah.
statistical overview of the last, 8 years of
Yeah.
starting quarterbacks, Kirk Cousins stats are 7, 8, 9,
Yeah.
right? So it's not about the stats. It's great that I think you and I are having this conversation because we had a conversation much earlier in the offseason, maybe in February or March, about quarterback archetypes, right? And how we kind of pigeonhole who quarterbacks are based on their archetype, but their archetype is just more, hey, how does their skill set and what are their particular things they need to master to become great? And with Purdy, I think we agreed that for Purdy, I don't want to put a ceiling on the player. I think a lot of people immediately put a ceiling when they talk about the process of this conversation. We don't actually know that ceiling. But what we do know for the process of Purdy to become a top 10 quarterback, that includes that he has to get the ball out on time and on rhythm consistently. Every play has to be, the ball has to come out on time and on rhythm. He has to play with unbelievable feel in the pocket, which means that with people around him, and he has to be able to feel space and be able to navigate the pocket. I think at times his pocket presence was excellent because he has excellent escapability. But at the same time, I think there were a lot of times, and you've talked about it, I've talked about it, a million people have talked about how he needs to climb the pocket where he left plays on the field. In fact, he himself talked about it. And so I think for Purdy, those are the things that need to happen for him to become a great quarterback, right? Like the archetype is that those things need to happen. And that's where I think some people say limited ceiling, because the archetype isn't that he can be the kind of quarterback that carries an offense based on his physical, tangible ability the way an Allen is doing right now, right? The archetype is he has to be a guy that wins with process, wins with timing, wins with accuracy, wins with smarts, processing, all of those kinds of things. And I don't know if he can do that, Jesse. I think a lot of people immediately say, well, he can't do that, and therefore he has that ceiling. I don't know that. But for us to put him in this top 10 conversation, he has to be elite in those areas because there's something elite about the 8 quarterbacks that we mentioned, right? Trevor Lawrence, pocket presence, size, arm, all elite, right? Justin Herbert, same 3 traits, all elite. Trevor Lawrence running is also elite, right? Josh Allen, every Jalen Hurts running, especially in the red zone, right? 10 plus rushing touchdowns the last 2 seasons, doesn't get mentioned. All 8 of those guys, something elite about their game. What is going to be elite about Purdy's game? Well, it has to be processing, pocket maneuverability, accuracy. Those are the kind of things. Again, not saying he can or can't do it, but that's what needs to happen for us to put him in this conversation.
Yeah. And do you think, let's say that all those things do become elite this year. Do you think 1 year's enough for you to say, okay, he's top 10, or do you need to see more? Like, how do you evaluate quarterbacks? When you just break down quarterbacks, do you need to see it for multiple years before you buy in? Like, what is the breaking point for you?
Yeah, the projection is really hard, right? Because you see it for a year and it can look really spectacular where you see a Carson Wentz. And you can go back now and say, hey, the process was always wrong with Carson Wentz. So it was going to go wrong at some point. But that's not how we felt, right? 6 years ago with Carson Wentz, because we felt like when you're that big, you're that athletic, you're able to play that well off schedule. Like, it's okay if the process is a little bit out of whack. It's okay if you're a little bit erratic. You make too many damn plays, right? So I do think that the projection is always hard. I take the year-to-year view of it. I look at what quarterbacks did in that year and what they did well. So, like, for example, I look at Geno, and I was high on Geno last year. I put Geno in that top 9, 10 conversation based on how he was playing last year. Now, overall in his career, Geno, still doesn't have the body of work to be there. But if we are going off of, hey, we are evaluating them solely for what they were last year, and that's the most recent football we have, he's a guy that enters that conversation. I've been mentioning this, so I'll mention this. I usually mention this with my friends, but to me, Geno is like if you put Jameis Winston and you took the turnover stupidity out of Jameis Winston, you had who Geno Smith was last year, the best of it, with the special throws, the size in the pocket, the ability to push the ball down the field. So I take the year-to-year approach very much so, Jesse. Like, there's a certain guys you can project a little bit with, right? Like, I know there's not a lot of positivity towards Kenny Pickett's rookie season. I didn't think it was that bad. I have some positivity projecting what's going to happen moving forward, right? Like, I have a little bit of positivity with Daniel Jones. I think Daniel Jones is going to be even better next year. But there's a few guys that I might project a little bit here or there because I'm biased. Like I just like them or I like something about them. But generally, I take the year to year, man.
Yeah, I think year to year can happen for positions like 8, 9, and 10 potentially, because we've got Hertz and Lawrence on here, and they really have the 1 year. Now,
Right.
again, we expect
Kyler
that
was
they're going
right
to
here after a year,
exactly.
right?
Kyler's
Yeah.
been there. Dak's now on there. Cousins, I mean, you could argue him or Carr, like you said, have been there. Watson, we've seen there. So I think 8, 9, and 10, those are positions that you can get after a year. I think to be a mainstay in the top 10, you've got to produce year in and year out. And even when you do like a Kirk Cousins, really Kirk Cousins has put together like 7 straight seasons better than Jimmy Garoppolo's best season of his career.
Right.
And I think a lot of people, when they look at Kirk Cousins, they say that he's in that Jimmy Garoppolo tier. A lot of 49er fans do. I know they do because I've seen it in my chats for a while now. So I think that's wrong. I would put Cousins clearly ahead of Jimmy, but that's how people view him around the league potentially, or fans or what have you. So it's not just a statistical thing. You have to be a reason why you're winning playoff games. There's a lot that goes into being a mainstay top 10 quarterback, and it's built off of year after year after year continually being that guy. It can't just be a 1 year flash in the pan thing for you to get above probably really 9 or 10.
I think you're probably describing the top 5 that way. And then we have those guys who are on the precipice of the top 5, right? Those are always my favorite quarterbacks of the previous era. That's why I like Ryan so much. I like Stafford. I liked Romo. I liked Carson Palmer. I liked Phillip Rivers. The guys that were just outside of the elite, which in our minds at the time was the Mannings, the Bradys, the Brees, Roethlisberger, Rodgers, right? Those were the 5 of that era. And then you had these guys who on any given game could elevate themselves to be the top 5 guy, but they didn't have that consistency to fit in. I think that exists throughout time, right? Like in this era, the mainstays seem to be Allen, Mahomes, Herbert, Burrow, and Lamar Jackson. And maybe Trevor Lawrence and Jalen Hurts are moving themselves towards that category. But outside of that, right, on a given year, like you mentioned, we can have 8 top 10 quarterbacks. We can also, I remember a couple years ago where I felt like, hey, there were 14, 15 top 10 quarterbacks. And I usually put Kirk Cousins as kind of the gatekeeper, right? If I can put you above Kirk Cousins, I'm like, okay, that's a quarterback. I feel like in a neutral situation, you can win a Super Bowl with that guy. Now, hey, 10 more things might have to go right for you to win a Super Bowl with Kyler Murray versus with you having to win a Super Bowl with Mahomes. But, there was a point where I felt like, hey, you can win a Super Bowl with Kyler Murray just because he was above that Kirk Cousins threshold. Well, this year, Kirk is closer to 10 than he is to 15. So there's not as many guys that you're feeling as confident about. And so I feel like Kirk is kind of that perfect consistency of being just right there, league above average, where he fits above. If you're below him, man, you got a guy below Kirk, man, it's tough to win. But if you got a guy Kirk or above, and by the way, I'm a believer that you can win a Super Bowl with Kirk. But he, like I told you on the phone this morning, there's a black cat running around Kirk Cousins' house. So it doesn't seem to be going that way for him. But yeah, I do think that he's kind of that threshold when we talk about top 10. Because if we can say you're better than Kirk, then I think we're talking about, hey, you're a franchise quarterback. Like a team would be comfortable paying you. You may not be Mahomes, but hey, like, do you think Dallas is upset with the production they've gotten out of the contract of Dak Prescott? Like, it hasn't been the best quarterback play, but the last 8, 9 years have been, top 15-ish for sure, top 10-ish in my opinion.
I think it's really hard when you talk about quarterback play in particular. And the reason why I think, we're on the Kirk Cousins conversation, and I think there is a real possibility he could be the 49ers quarterback next year. I know we joke about it, and I know that you believe that that's a possibility as well based off our conversation this morning. But, it seems like a lot more people are opening up to that idea now that that quarterback show is out and they see the things that he goes through to prepare and try to be the best player he can be. But it's tough. When you get into that Dak Prescott, Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, that level where you're borderline top 10, you're kind of there, but you're kind of not. Depends on the year. I don't know what's worse. I don't know if it's worse to not have a quarterback and you're trying to figure it out, or have a guy like that that's not quite the guy, but you're paying a large sum of money to. Like, you're kind of in purgatory of winning a Super Bowl But how do you move on from a guy like that? Because finding somebody better is really tough. I don't know. What do you think's worse? Do you think it's worse trying to figure out your guy constantly, or potentially overpaying for a guy who's borderline top 10?
So this is an unbelievable conversation. I used to have this conversation with Grant actually a couple of years ago. And by the way, a lot of people don't remember this. And maybe somebody should say this to Grant, but Grant used to be fanatical about quarterback Moneyball.
Oh, yeah, he
used
did.
to be fanatical. Yeah. Remember, he used to love the stat. Hey, no quarterback above 14% had taking up more than 14% of their salary cap has won the Super Bowl, right? He used to love that stat, and he would point it out with Jimmy Garoppolo. So I know that, in some ways, like, it's his dream. Like, what the 49ers are doing at quarterback right now is like Grant Cohn's like ultimate vision from 2 years ago. Like, if you have a Jimmy Garoppolo, just do this. Get cheap, have 3 young, viable guys, and see what you get out of it rather than having the Jimmy Garoppolo. So that would be, I guess, his answer, right? That's his answer. My answer, it really just depends on the guy, right? Like, if your top 10-ish guy is Stafford, right? Where, hey, like, he's the guy that's borderline top 10, but there's a few things about his game that are so elite that, hey, if I catch him on the right playoff run and he just gets hot for 3 games, he can do something special, right? Flacco is an example of this, right? Like, Flacco was a top 20 quarterback for the majority of his career. But what did Flacco have in the AFC, right? He had size. He had a great arm, one of the biggest arms you've seen. He was a very pure, over-the-top thrower of the football. Well, if the playoffs include, I have to go play Manning in Denver where it's going to be cold. I have to go play Brady in Gillette where it's going to be cold and windy. You have to go play Roethlisberger in Heinz Field, right? This is what you have to do to make the playoffs. Well, then having Flacco be your top 20-ish quarterback, but he has the ability in those conditions to actually play with those guys because he's physically that gifted, I'd take a chance on that. But if it's Cousins, right, where with Cousins, everything is good, status quo, but if I put him in a cold weather game, damn, I'm not sure if his arm can really cut through that, right? Because you might have to deal with that in the playoffs. Well, shoot, if I put Kirk in a game where the protection's really bad, can he just get out of the pocket and make play after play, right? If you can't answer that question. So I think it very much depends on the skill set of that particular quarterback that you're stuck playing in between, right? If you have a quarterback that's stuck there because he's inconsistent, but he has ability, I'd take the chance just because you never know when that ability might come through. But if he's like Garoppolo, where he's like ceilinged, where there's slow-footedness, where, hey, this is capacity-wise, this is the maximum he can do, I would look to do what the Niners did. And that's where, as much as I've mentioned this to you multiple times this offseason, much as I hate everything the Niners are doing at the quarterback position, I can't criticize it because given the cards that they were dealt and what they created coming into this year, this to me is the best case scenario of what I would have done as well.
But long story short, be excited for Kirk Cousins. All right, let's get to some of these super chats. Smack Jones actually came in over on Vish's channel and says, what would be viewed as enough production for Lance to never see Purdy again? 3,200 yards, 32 and 17, 350 rushing. Also, this is going to be Brandon's breakout year. Okay, let's take the first part of this. What would it take for Lance that we would never see Purdy again? Well, first of all, Purdy's, I think you agree with this. It has less to do with Lance right now and more to do with what Purdy can't do. If Purdy is unavailable for any reason, that's how Lance sees the field week 1. Now, once he sees the field, they're going to have to win games. They're going to have to win games, and he's going to have to show. I don't know if there's a statistical figure that's going to keep him on the field. It's winning games, building confidence, and showing that improvement. If he's showing that consistent improvement and they're continuing to win, that's all it's going to take. I can't put a stat number on it because I don't know what the stats would look like. I also don't know the game flow and how it would go. There's a possibility where he throws for 170, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, rushes for 30 and a touchdown, and they win that game. And then the next game, he looks a little bit better and they continue to win and so forth and so on. There's many scenarios where he could keep his job, but just to get on the field, it's less about what he does and more about what Brock can't do, in my opinion, for him to be able to see that field in the first place. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
you're absolutely right. Let's say for the sake of this scenario, he does get on the field. To
Okay.
me, it has nothing to do with the stats. It's going to be for whomever starts at quarterback. It's going to be about the wins and losses. Even if they play really shitty, if the Niners are winning, they're going to pretend like the quarterback's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I just
Yep.
take us back to 2019, right? I mean, have we seen a quarterback play crappier to start 8-0 in a season? The first 7 games were brutal, man. The 8th game, Halloween, feels great, baby. Played outstanding in Arizona. In the second half of the season, he really played well. He
He did.
really played well. Jimmy
Yep.
Garoppolo played well. But the first 7 games, he was terrible. I mean, does anybody remember the Rams game, week 5, the Marcus Peters interception that he threw? What the hell was that? Missing Tevin Coleman in the flat, right? Like, there was some brutal stuff. Even the Cincinnati game, man, there was some misthrows in that one, and they crushed Cincinnati. They could have beaten Cincinnati by 80, with a different quarterback. Like, he played poorly against Carolina, and they smacked Carolina. So I think it's going to be less about how the quarterback actually plays, because we're not going to be worried about nitpicking at the court. Well, I mean, I might be worried about nitpicking at the quarterback, but the average person is not going to be nitpicking at the quarterback if they're winning games. And I think this goes for any of them. Like, they could be playing excellent, right? Not even excellent. They could be playing like mid-tier, mediocre, right? Like average play, pretty solid play, like passable play. And if the Niners start 3-4, 3-5, we'll say, wait, hey, you got to replace the quarterback. It's the quarterback's fault. And that's a situation that they've created where we're not sure, who's really that guy. Maybe it becomes more crystallized once Purdy is fully healthy. I think it should become that, and I hope they do that for Purdy's sake. But I think it's way less about the stats and just 100% about, hey, who's opportunistically getting the W's.
Yeah, and once you make that decision to pull a quarterback, whoever it is, you can't undo that. It's over. Like it's done.
Once you go on from him, you're done with him. It's over.
Yeah.
You can't go
Yeah.
back to him.
And that's not just this year. That's like forever. It's over. You are done. So you really have to make sure that you're ready to do that and make that decision and basically put, whether it's Trey Lance or Brock Purdy, you have to be willing to basically say, we are done with this player. We are done with this project before you make that decision. And also, stats aside, it's how are they playing within Shanahan's offense? There's a couple plays that stand out to me, one for Trey Lance and one for Brock Purdy. Trey Lance against Houston, where they're backed up against in the end zone. I think it was Debo running a slant. He's wide open on the slant. Trey Lance doesn't throw it. It might have been Kittle. He bails, rolls to his right, completes the pass to Brandon Ayuk. And I remember in that moment, I think I tweeted, I'm glad he completed the pass, but Shanahan's going to have a conversation with him in that film room. And then for Brock Purdy, the great play to George Kittle back left of the end zone where he had Jennings on a speed out, easily could have had him for a touchdown, passed it up, rolled out, made a really good play. A lot of people celebrated it, but that's an opportunity where Shanahan's going, it didn't have to be that hard. Throw it to the open guy. Let's get out of here, make it easy. So I think a lot of it comes down to that as well. Maybe some of the things that most people aren't necessarily picking up on that he's going to be looking at and saying, I think if we had this quarterback in, it could look better because they can execute what it is that I'm looking for. So I think some of that plays into it as well.
I think he might think that, Jesse. Like, in fact, I think in 2019, given some of the reporting that was done before the 19 season by Chris Mortensen and Mike Silver, I think Shanahan probably felt Nick Mullins could play better than Garoppolo through those 7 games. In fact, I always felt like if you go to 2020, I think it revealed so much of how highly they thought of Nick Mullins at the time. Remember, the 2020 season, the funniest thing is, as bad as Nick Mullins was in that season, he had the best individual game by a quarterback for the 49ers, right? That week 3 game against the Giants, it was like, whoa, Nick Mullins, throw after throw. And then he went to Philadelphia on Sunday Night Football, and the moment was too big for him. He wet the bed on national TV, right? Like the missed the use check, like he wet the bed on national TV.
Yeah.
But I think that in Shanahan's mind, like that was always a better executor, though he was not as gifted, a better executor of his offense than Jimmy, right? I mean, that's what Mike Silver reported. That's what Chris Mortensen reported. And he was never able to make the move to him because there's just a team investment. I don't think I think the team will feel rallied around the quarterback, whomever is starting, regardless of how poorly they're playing, if they're winning. And that's where it becomes tough to replace him, even if your process tells you, hey, like this is the better option from a pure analytical standpoint. I think there's also the emotional and psychological aspect of football. And like you mentioned, where if you replace a guy, you can't go back to him. And when you replace a guy when you're winning, it's extremely, extremely difficult.
Yeah, most definitely it is. Great question by Smack Jones. Great comment. We appreciate you. Ink Talk TV says Brock Purdy better put out a mixtape, a reel, a Vine, something. I'm tired of hearing if he is healthy week 1. Trey is having an amazing offseason. Ink Talk TV, I'm going to kind of pair this with your call in on Ryan's show on Sunday. I definitely caught a big chunk of that. And I know that you are big on Trey Lance. I know that you are not so big on Brock Purdy. So we'll see. We'll see what ends up happening here. I don't know. I think I'm definitely tired of hearing that as well. But unless Brock Purdy cannot go,
right?
Yeah, I mean, unless Brock Purdy just cannot go, it's going to be really, really, really hard for Trey Lance to take over that position. I'm not saying I agree with that. I just think reading the tea leaves and what's being said and how the 49ers operate, that's the process that we are headed down. So we'll see.
By the way, I also want to mention this with Trey Lance, right? I think there's certain mechanical improvements that he can certainly facilitate to happen over the course of an offseason. And I'm sure he has made every stride in order to do that. But as you know, one of the reasons I was a bit skeptical of this particular fit before the draft, and I remain skeptical, is just the timeline of him getting enough games. And I do think that regardless of whatever mechanical and fundamental advancements he makes, there's also, hey, he needs to get 8, 9, 10, 11 games of experience where he can just get the scope of what are his capabilities on the field. Every quarterback needs to go through that process, right? It's the early process in their career. What throws can I make? What can I get away with against certain defenses? There's a level of comfort to playing. And I guess one of my biggest worries with doing this, well, I expect this from him, I expect this from him. Realistically, we are expecting strides from a player in a span of 3 months without playing football in actual games. That's not realistic, right? We're expecting him to completely re-envision who he is without actually doing it on a football game, in a football
Right.
game. And that's where I'm a little bit, as much as I am high on, hey, this guy is putting in the work, this guy is improving, how are we going to actually make those strides, right, in 3 months? Like, I do think there's a level of, even if he makes these strides, he needs 8, 9, 10, 11 football games. And it might take an offseason after playing that. And that's where I don't want to be the Debbie Downer on the Trey Lance train, because he seems to be working to creating this sort of excitement that's coming there with him. But I don't feel it to be realistic. Like, what quarterback, like, do you remember when they told us that Blaine Gabbert was a completely different player? You know,
Oh,
like
yeah.
he's a completely different player. And I was like, wait, how is this going to happen? We just saw him a couple months ago and he was the same exact Blaine Gabbert we've seen. And I'm not saying Trey Lance is Blaine Gabbert. I'm just saying that in order to make these transformations, you do need, it is gradual, right? Like, we saw Jalen Hurts play a level of football, go into an offseason, come back as a different player, play some more football that way, go into an offseason and come back as a different player again. And I do think some level of that needs to happen for Trey Lance. And I think in some ways, some of it is unfair where we're like, hey, Trey, just go in the offseason and throw the ball 80 times a day and just become a different quarterback, without saying, hey, Trey, like, glad you're working on all these fundamental things. Now let's give you your opportunity to play 8, 9, 10, 11 games in a row and then see where you are from there.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point because, you know, I've talked about, let's say Trey Lance does get 4 games. And regardless of how he plays, they go back to Brock Purdy. People are going to make a snap judgment on what Trey Lance is, and maybe Trey Lance played really well, I'm still going to be in the same boat. I'm still going to believe that Trey Lance can be a good player, but I'm still going to say I haven't seen enough. 4 more games is not going to give me insight as to who he's fully going to be. Now, it would be encouraging if we saw some improvements for sure, but to expect major leaps would be crazy. Just like I think expecting major leaps from Brock Purdy this offseason is also really, really hard because he hasn't had an offseason to actually get better. He's been rehabbing, and this is his first offseason. So I think it's interesting because you have a split in the fan base, and both sides are really pushing for one quarterback or the other. And I think both sides might be being a little bit unrealistic about what is probably going to happen for either one on the field, especially early on in the season.
Oh, 100%. And I think you have a very good idea on how I feel and what I think about a lot of this, and we will see it play out on the field. I don't want to be the guy that's a Debbie Downer to anybody's optimism, but in a lot of ways, I'm very skeptical of this situation for any of these quarterbacks.
Yeah, most definitely. Deshaun DeVos says Brock Purdy is a system quarterback. We are amazed by his play, and we base that play on his draft status. But when you look at this list, you have to now compare him to real franchise quarterbacks. He does not stack up. What do you think of that comment?
I think Deshaun is right? Like, that's why 6'5" quarterbacks get taken at the top of the draft, right? That's why we value size. That's why Bryce Young, even though every other part of his game is so good, we still had such a conversation about him going number 1 overall with his size, because like size, arm strength, like these are tangible things that we value prototypically for sure. But I think that having those things gives you a better chance at being a top 10 quarterback. But at the same time, I don't necessarily close the door, if that makes sense, on other guys being that. Like, you have a better chance if you're 6'5" like Trevor Lawrence and you have Trevor Lawrence's arm strength. But at the end of the day, what makes you an elite quarterback is not those tangible gifts. It's, hey, parts of my game are elite. Hey, Justin Herbert, I throw the ball better than anybody else in the world, right? That's elite. There's something you do that's elite. Breeze, the most mechanically, fundamentally perfect quarterback that maybe we've ever seen in terms of footwork to timing to accuracy to mechanics, all of those kinds of things, right? So for me with Purdy, I understand Deshaun's point, but I don't want to pigeonhole and say, well, he can't do these things elite, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to make the difference for him on being an elite player. It's not, hey, he doesn't have these tangible gifts. That puts him behind the 8 ball, but it doesn't necessarily make those things inaccessible for him. It'll be a case of how truly talented is he and whether those things are attainable at some point.
Yeah, I think there's only a certain amount of boxes you can check. And to your point, when we were talking about that top 10 list and really the mainstay, the guys that are consistently there, they have 2 to 4 things that they're elite at. And when you look at a Trey Lance, there's like a potential of 6 things he could be elite at. It doesn't mean that he's going to reach potential in all of them, but you look at everything he brings to the table.
The different archetypes of quarterback he could be.
Correct. There's 6 or so things to choose from. Now, he may not ever get elite in any of them, but I'll take my chances of if he has to check 3 boxes and he has 6 chances to do that. I like that. Versus somebody like Brock Purdy also can be elite, but he really only has 3 chances to be elite, and he better check all those boxes because of just physical limitations. And so it doesn't mean that he can't and Trey can, or vice versa. It just means you have less of a chance. And so in order for you to check those boxes and become elite, you have to do something special and unique like a Drew Brees. There's a reason that there's not a lot of quarterbacks that fit that stature, that arm strength, becoming elite players, because they only have so many options to make it to that point, and they better be on point in every single one of those.
And I love the way you describe that, because I've made that point earlier to you on the phone, and I think I've made it a couple times in streams, but I don't think I've ever actually elocuted it that way. Like, I think that was such a perfect way to say it, because I think that's what ceiling is. I think ceiling is less about, well, this is what you can be and this is what you can't be. I think that's how people talk about it. Do we really know? Hell no. None of us know. But what we do know is that in order to be elite, as a quarterback, you need to have multiple parts of your game that are elite compared to the rest of your peers, right? You need that. And while Trey Lance could be horrible at 6 different traits, he has 6 different opportunities to get the 3. And you need
Yep.
3, right? 3. I'm just throwing an arbitrary number.
Yeah,
And
right.
in Brock's case, it's not that he can't become elite. It's just that the 3 things that he has that can become elite have to become elite for him to become elite. And I think that's a great way to describe ceiling. But I don't think that necessarily, means Brock Purdy can't be that either. And I always want
For
to
sure.
say that too, because we really don't know.
No, you don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people saw glimpses from Drew Brees, but even especially after his injury with the Chargers and then hitting free agency, and was he going to go to Miami? Was he going to become a Saint? I think him playing in a dome certainly helped
Right.
with a
Okay.
lot of that.
So there we go. Right. Playing with
Right.
Sean Payton, playing with
Yep.
the dome. They had a lot of really good receivers early parts of his career. They had a lot of really good offensive linemen, right? Jari Evans was an all-pro guard. Carl Nicks, all-pro guard, right? Jermon Bushrod made a few Pro Bowls
Yep.
as a left tackle. Then they drafted Teron Armstead, who was an all-pro left tackle. They drafted, Ryan Ramczyk, who was an all-pro right tackle, right? Like they drafted well up front. They always had good receivers from the days of Bobby Meacham and Marcus Colston and Devery Henderson and Lance Moore to, then getting the Alvin Kamaras and all that. They had Reggie Bush, Deuce McCann. They had things around him.
Don't
And
forget
even
about
with
Jimmy
that,
Graham.
Right, Jimmy Graham as well, right? One of the best receiving tight ends for that span that we had ever seen in NFL history. But the thing with even Breeze is that there was limitations at the end of the day to Breeze, right? Like playing outdoors was a problem for Breeze at the end of the day, right? Playing outdoors in the playoffs was an issue for Breeze. Heck, I mean, I look at the Saints of the last 4 or 5 years, that end of the era run they had with Sean Payton, and I think it's one of the bigger what-ifs in NFL history. They had the best team in the NFL in 2018 when they got robbed by the Nicole Robinson, Roby Coleman play. They had a very good team in 2017. You could argue maybe the Kamara, Lattimore, they were too young. In 2020, the COVID year, they had the best team. They beat the Bucs twice, and then they lost at home against Tampa Bay as the 1 seed. And Breeze played awful in all of those games, even 19, right? I don't know that they would have gotten through that 49ers team. But even in 19, they lost an ugly game to Minnesota where Breeze really struggled. So even Breeze's limitations at the end of his career, I thought that's what affected the Saints not winning a Super Bowl too.
Yeah, and I mean, as good as Breeze was, I don't know. I mean, it seems like more people have come around to it now, but a couple years ago when I made the statement, it was a real battle. But give me Roethlisberger.
I agree.
Give me Roethlisberger. Like, I know that if I take Roethlisberger and throw him in a dome and put him in that situation, he's going to be successful and he's going to win. I can't say the same thing about Breeze if I put him on the Steelers and make him play his whole career outside.
100%.
I don't know.
And where you have to throw the ball deep and outside the numbers. I mean, Big Ben has gotten how many different receivers paid, right? Like, you got Mike Wallace paid, Emmanuel Sanders paid, Antonio Brown paid, Martavis Bryant
Antonio
paid,
Holmes,
right? He made it work with Marcus Wheaton for a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So anyways, we got off on a whole thing. I knew we would when we talked about quarterbacks. That's the way it goes with us. I got that one right? Brock Purdy. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Saul says, I like Purdy, but Team Lance, if Lance becomes the eventual starter, who's the ideal backup? I say McSorley from the Cardinals, similar skill set and should be cheap. Brock Purdy is the backup that you want. I mean, you've seen that you can win games with Brock Purdy. He's also inexpensive. I think he's also a really good person and a really good leader. He would be the ideal backup if Trey Lance became the eventual starter. I would still rock with Brock for sure
100%.
if you can.
That one's made for it, right? He's a 7th round pick, so you can basically kind of just shove him back into that backup place. He doesn't have much of a choice. He can play as a relief. Like, the funniest thing about this conversation, forget being a Lance guy, Purdy guy. I think Purdy has a viable career with the 49ers for the next 2-3 years, even if he doesn't win the starting job at the end of this year. To me, Trey Lance has no chance at carrying on this team as a backup, because he's the worst case scenario that you would want as your backup quarterback, right?
Yes.
So it's a really interesting situation, because even Darnold, like I think Darnold could have a couple of years where he just keeps hanging around as the backup, possibly if no team takes him and gives him too much money or more money than he deserves. I think Purdy, worst case scenario for him is that he's going into 2024 as the 49ers backup. Lance, I think he could be
Yes.
on a different team if things don't work out here in 2023 for him.
Agree completely. If Purdy's not the starter, he's the backup, and he's your backup for a while. If Trey's not the starter, he's gone.
Yeah.
Like there's no in between for him. And then the ideal backup to Purdy would be you're probably just going to keep drafting guys. Really is what's going to happen. Just keep drafting guys, play through the cheap contracts and roll that way. And hopefully that, Purdy can keep it going and continue to be the starter. But yeah, I think one has a path to be the backup here if they're not the starter, and the other one doesn't. I agree with that for sure. Big Daddy 49er says, here's a super sticker. Appreciate that. Ink Talk TV comes back and says, Purdy ain't bad. Purdy just don't have what's missing. They are literally trying to replace Jimmy 1 with Jimmy 2, a handful of wins and playoff berths, but unattainable to get over the hump. We need a big arm.
I will say this. Jimmy 1 and Jimmy 2, I'd never like that comparison, and I'm not even going to do it for the on-the-field stuff because, Jesse, you know how I hate comparing quarterbacks that I don't find to have remotely similar skill sets. Like, I understand it's a level comparison, but I like talking skill set over level. It's because one of Jimmy's biggest issues was the earlier conversation that I brought up, right? One of Grant's favorite topics from a couple years ago, right? How much he was getting paid. You don't have that issue with this guy, right? Like Jimmy for $6-7 million, whew, that's a bargain even today, even with all of Jimmy's issues. And this guy is making less than $1 million a year. I think that there's a large cost distinction on what you can put around this guy for similar level play to a guy that, you decided to give $27 million a year, which at the time was making him the highest paid in terms of annual average. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the skill set's completely different. Like maybe the tier of quarterback eventually, like if Brock never improves and kind of stays who he is today, then yeah, you're kind of getting
right?
that.
He's already there.
Yeah, exactly. He's already there. There's still room for improvement. With Jimmy, it was not only that he was getting paid a lot, but we eventually found out there just was no improvement. And I think that we all thought after 2017 there would be improvement. I think most people gave him grace.
Everybody thought after 2019, remember? After 2019, they said his first year was way better than Matt Ryan's first year in the offense.
For sure. And when you looked at 2019, you talked about how bad it started for the first 7 games, but a lot of people were like, hey, listen, he's coming off of an ACL. Like, give him time. And then he started to show it a little bit. He went on a bit of a tear and you're like, okay, he's sitting astride. Now he's healthy. He's getting comfortable. This is what we can expect. We're on this arc. And then all of a sudden it was like, and we just never got better. So
how much do you think the 49ers, this is a little bit off topic. You're absolutely right about Jimmy, but I've always wondered this. How much do you think they crapped their pants when they had that Denver preseason game that was a national TV spot? I think it was Monday night on ESPN. And he comes out and he has maybe the 2 worst series that you've ever seen from a starting quarterback in preseason. Like, it was as bad as it gets. Like, and there was pressure, right? Because they had put everything in. Well, we're going to be bad the first 2 years, but we're going to be really good. And they had spent a lot of money in the offseason. They thought they were going to be a really good team. They knew they were going to have it on defense. And they have this highly paid quarterback coming back and doing that in preseason. What do you think? What do you think was going on?
Oh, the panic meter had to have been through the roof because remember that was coming off of joint practices where he had a 5-pick practice. So we heard about that. And then all of a sudden it was like 2 days later, they're playing in a game and he has a quarterback rating of like 0.
Yeah.
And looked awful. It was like, I don't know.
Scared, terrified.
Yeah, of course he did. So I'm sure that there had to, but that's again, when Silver reports started coming out and could they go with Mullins? And so there was definitely some panic there, no doubt about it. Third string all pro says if we're going off of needing a big arm, Darnold has the biggest arm on the team. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't.
Yeah, pure power. It's definitely Lance.
It's Lance. I think
Darnold's got the most creative throwing ability in terms of the most variance in terms of his arm angles, his platforms, and all of that. But pure just power, it's definitely Lance. I don't find Darnold's pure power to be, a high end arm in terms of he's just flicking it with 90-mile-an-hour fastballs. He's got a decent arm, but it's more about the actual throwing talent and less about the arm power. Whereas with Lance, it's the latter. But the last time I talked about this with Lance, I'll never forget it. I talked about it on Mondays with Vish. I was like, hey, I haven't seen a lot of these creative throws from Trey Lance and all of that. I'm not sure that that's really part of his throwing talent. Next thing I know, some Stanford receiver on the practice squad is leaking footage of Lance making me put my foot in my mouth like 2 hours later. And I was like, damn. But those are ridiculous. I haven't seen much like that since. But, I also haven't seen him much since.
Yeah, there really hasn't been a lot since. No, you're right about that. But no, as far as pure arm strength, it's Lance, and it's not particularly close. So I disagree with that comment wholeheartedly. Okay. Let's talk about this Play Callers podcast. There's a lot coming out of this. And Vish, you and I talked this morning. I had listened to, what is there? I think there's like 6 episodes, something like that. 5. Okay. I listened to episode 5, part of episode 4. I was kind of working backwards. After we talked, I listened to episode 1, 2, and I'm partway through 3. What are some of the biggest takeaways you have when it comes to this Play Callers podcast? And just to set the tone, this is the podcast that's on The Athletic where they are talking to basically Shanahan and his whole coaching tree. You get appearances from Robert Saleh, Chris Forrester, Sean McVay, LaFleur.
Kevin O'Connell.
Who else is on there? McDaniels, who?
Kevin O'Connell.
A little bit
from Zach Taylor.
Zach Taylor, yep. So basically
Raheem
the Shanahan
Morris
coaching
is in there
tree.
a lot.
Oh yeah, Morris is in there as well. Yep. Yeah, I wish they would tell you who's talking every time so that you could, because they just start throwing people in and you're like, it takes you a minute to catch up. And you're like, okay, now you got to rewind and re-listen because now I'm listening to it differently because it's this person, not this person. So, but other than that, there's a lot of coaches in there from this coaching tree. It's a great listen, highly recommend it. But overall, what are some of the biggest takeaways you have with this podcast?
Yeah, first of all, I thought it was so fascinating. Shout out to Jordan Rodriguez. That was outstanding journalism. One of the, probably best pieces of content I've consumed this, in a long time in general. That was fantastic. Jesse, I have so many takeaways. How long do you want this show to be if you really
let's go. No, let's go. I mean, we can, we have other topics, but this, depending on how long it goes, this could be the end of it, so if we go an hour on this, then we go an hour. It is what it is.
This was incredible. And I thought we got a kind of individual lens into each of these 4 individuals, particularly McDaniel, LaFleur, Shanahan, and McVay, who they are, what they're like, and their relationship with each other that I thought was fascinating, particularly, of course, the McDaniel-Shanahan dynamic when it felt like McDaniel took, a couple of very direct shots at Kyle Shanahan and then a few that made everybody pause and say, was he talking about Kyle Shanahan when he said that? And it felt a little intentional for him to be talking that way. And then, you had McVay and you learned about his intensity, his work ethic, and all of that. And then you had Shanahan and you learn about his journey, what the scheme means to him, right? The scheme is kind of everything to him. You can feel that. You can see that. You hear about his coaching style. You hear experts from Robert Griffin. You hear how Shanahan influenced McVay and McDaniel and LaFleur. And I would say, Jesse, before we delve deeper, the number one, I got 2 takeaways from these characters. Number one, they respect Shanahan for teaching them the scheme and putting it together to give them a philosophical thought process to start on. But they don't necessarily revere Shanahan. They're competitive with Shanahan, right? They don't, and I think that's very important because they don't view themselves as under Shanahan, even though they learned something from him. They view themselves as equal with him. He just gave them the lens to learn this. I think that's a very important distinction in terms of how you look at, guys that are your bosses, quote unquote, which Shanahan was for every single one of these individuals. The other thing is, I think there's a stark difference in the characters of McDaniel, Shanahan, and McVay versus LaFleur. I think LaFleur, wants to be the best. I think he's competitive. I think he works really hard at his job, but I don't think he necessarily thinks of him as better than McVay. I don't think he thinks of himself as better than Shanahan or better than McDaniel. And he didn't come across that way. In fact, he came across very complimentary of their skill sets, and I'm a competitor with that. I think Shanahan thinks he's way better than McVay. He's way better than McDaniel. I think McDaniel thinks he's way better than McVay. He's way better than Shanahan. He's way better than LaFleur. I think he said a few statements that would indicate that he thinks as much. And then finally, you have McVay, who I think thinks the same exact thing. And I thought those two dynamics were, two things that were fascinating, because I think it prevailed in a lot of what they talked about throughout the entirety of the podcast, which does span, 12 years in their career.
Yeah, I got the same feeling. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe I'm being cynical, but there's a lot of parts that I'm listening to where they're trying to spin things as positives, and I didn't take them as positives. They talked about that whole stint in Washington and how it was positive that they were all yelling at each other and having these shouting matches and at each other's necks day in and day out. And I'm like, okay, like, I guess if you say that's a positive environment, but really after 1 year, it all fell apart.
Well,
so
not
how
everybody
positive
even
was
thought
it?
it was a positive, right? You're getting
Right.
straight into the depth of it, right? Because
Yeah.
there's quotes from McDaniel later where he talks about how useless he thinks yelling is, and how he thinks yelling and throwing tantrums affects players, and you have to learn to keep your emotions. It's not that you aren't emotional, it's that those emotions don't do anything in terms of solving the job, right? And all of those things feel like direct shots. In fact, I think the most direct shot was when they were talking about what play calling means to them. And, Shanahan, LaFleur, and McVay are just going on and on about how it's a form of expression. It's their film. It means everything to them. It's how they can give their players an advantage. And McDaniel comes in and he's like, I think it's asinine for play callers to think that they actually have an effect. How many good play calls do you call that don't work? And how many shitty play calls do you call that work? Like, why do you think that your play calls are what making the effect? Like, the timing of those kinds of things was just unbelievable. I know I took us a little bit off track. I wanted to come to that real point, which was that McDaniel also shut that entire idea of yelling and screaming down. But yeah, you're right. Like, it was mentioned
he did.
as a
well,
positive.
didn't Forrester talk a little bit about it too, or he was like, dude, like, this is not a good environment.
He did.
Like, what are we doing here? Like, he would tell him, like, shut up, like, stop having these conversations. They're pointless. So I don't know. I felt like it was interesting. Now I know that at that point, Mike Shanahan was the head coach. So these things are all happening under Mike. And, obviously all of these individuals at that time had a lot to prove. They were a lot younger, a lot less mature in life, not only in football, but just in life. And they were looked at as a group that were given opportunities because Mike gave them opportunities, and they were all Kyle's buddies, is the way the league looked at them. And so they all felt like they had something to prove. It is interesting, though, all of the little bickering that comes out of this whole thing. I think McDaniel is the most forthright person and really gives you an insight to how things really are. And I just love how honest
is pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty simple. He feels at the end of the day that the reason his career got to where it was slower than McVay and Shanahan is because their familial NFL connections benefited and facilitated their growth, whereas he had to be kind of hidden and he had to prove himself extra because nobody would promote, 20-year-old recovering alcoholic Mike McDaniel, which, by the way, he kind of attributes his alcoholism to not, like, he doesn't, I want to be very sensitive to the demons that he's struggling with, but even when he talks about his demons, instead of saying, well, I went through something and I had to, go through it and grow from it, he says, well, that was a symptom of the environment I was in at the time, and I had to let that go to give up my alcoholism. He doesn't say, like, oh, I fight with it every day. It was, I had to let go, understanding that I'm not getting what I deserve, and once I let it go, I stopped drinking. Like, it was a coping mechanism for him when he thought he wasn't getting what he deserved. And by the way, he used the word exploitative when he's, one of the first sentences he says, I owe my entire career to Kyle Shanahan, ... no matter how exploitative at times.
Oh man. I just the whole podcast series would be different if he wasn't a part of it. I'll
Right.
definitely say that. Uh, okay, a couple of the takeaways. Let's get a little bit deeper. A couple of the takeaways that I have. One, I think McDaniels again. There's a lot of different takeaways, but he talks about ego and how he hired Fangio, and basically he had to remove his ego from the situation. And I found this very interesting that he said this, and he said it in the way that he said it, especially when I went back and kind of laid out the timeline of what happened with Fangio this offseason. Remember, there was a smaller reporter from the Miami Dolphins that came out and tweeted that a deal between Fangio and the Dolphins was done and would be announced in the next day or two. Then that announcement didn't come. People started crushing him on Twitter. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right.
What's going on? Is he going to sign? Is he not? And then about a week later, yes, there you go. About a week later, we hear he's interviewing with the 49ers, which we know that Fangio was a part of the 49ers offseason. They leaned on him a lot as far as game planning and putting together their defense this offseason. It was talked about. A lot of us assumed that meant that Fangio would eventually replace D'Amico Ryans once he moved on at the end of the season. D'Amico moves on. All of a sudden, Fangio's not taking this Miami job. He's clearly waiting to go to San Francisco. He interviews with Steve, he interviews, Steve Wilkes interviews. And then about a day or two later, Fangio signs with the Dolphins, which tells us, okay, we're getting Wilkes.
Right.
That's the route they decided to go. So clear that there was some sort of difference between Fangio and Shanahan. I'm not going to call it ego, but there was a difference, and there's a reason that they went with Wilkes. So now you fast forward to Mike talking about the situation, and he says, well, listen, and it came up earlier in the podcast as well, that Fangio basically has all the answers to the Shanahan offense. He knows how to stop the Shanahan offense.
Right.
And so they had to work around Fangio and trying to figure out how to beat what he was bringing to the table, because he's the one that put together the recipe to kill the offense.
Right. They talk about it with Goff, right? How they ruined him in practice because he had to keep going against this defense that had all the answers to his offense.
Right. And then all of the spinoffs and how the Rams had missed the playoffs the year after going to the Super Bowl because they couldn't figure out how to stop this defense. And by the time they figured it out, it was too late. They were out of the race, what have you. So you have all that happen. Mike then says, hey, I'm removing my ego from this situation. What kind of leader would I be if I were to put my ego in front of it and not hire Fangio, who I know can bring something new to the table and make me better? I think ego's BS, basically. I felt like that was a direct shot at Shanahan in this situation. That's the way that I took it. How did you take it?
Yeah, I found it to be a direct shot at Shanahan as well. In fact, I think there's so much that you delved into that's fascinating that we can delve further into. But first and foremost, to answer your question, I found it to be a direct shot at Shanahan for sure. I don't know if that shot is necessarily a bad thing. Because I think in a lot of ways, like, for example, I've said this a few times this offseason, and this, further, emphasizes my point. So I'm pretty happy. I'm willingly happy to, just bring up one of my previous points. I don't sense that there's going to be a large change in this defense with Steve Wilkes, right? I heard the same thing. Oh, D'Amico's going to blitz. Hey, everybody. D'Amico's going to blitz. D'Amico's going to blitz way more than Saleh. D'Amico's aggressive. D'Amico came from Philadelphia. D'Amico's going to blitz. All bullshit. It was bullshit. Same thing's going to happen with Steve Wilkes. He's not blitzing. You know why? Philosophically, this defense wants to blitz a certain amount, not because this is how the defensive coordinator envisions that they play. This is how the head coach wants them to play defense, right? There's that entire saga of like a 30-minute spiel in one of the episodes about Robert Saleh and Kyle Shanahan arguing about how the defense could look, and Shanahan ultimately winning that argument by shifting the front to a wide 9. And that was their adjustment, right? There were 2 adjustments, right, to the defense. One was the 6-1 front with Fangio and them doing that. The other one was this wide 9 thing, and it was a Shanahan adjustment to his offense. And him and Saleh agreed. Shanahan won out in terms of installing that. Saleh said that, installing quarters coverage and installing the wide nine, right? And by the way, Mike McDaniel directly takes credit in that, saying that their power schemes and all of that, their adaptations to that were figured out by him, not by anybody else. So yeah. I'd like to also mention that. So I think that that's really important, where Shanahan is a control freak on how he wants this defense to look and how he wants this defense to support his offense. In fact, he mentions that, right? He says that, well, if all you want me to do is run the ball, well, if I can run the ball, well, then I can get anybody open. And I learned that in 2019. So if I have a defense that can just keep the game close for me, I can just get people open in the pass game because everybody's going to play the run and we'll win games, right? This is an exact sequence of how he talks in the podcast and all of that. So I think that it's just his line of thinking. He has a strong football philosophical backbone on who he wants to be and how he wants to control his team. I think he's married to that scheme and that philosophy. And I think that that's where, we see the evolution, because Kyle in a lot of ways stayed tied to this wide zone scheme, even though it's not based out of wide zone as much, right? Like, they kept making their evolutions on the scheme. McVay, on the other hand, threw the scheme out and said, well, we got to be more of a drop back offense. Let me go and get Matthew Stafford, and we're going to run a lot of traditional drop back concepts, and we're going to be a traditional drop back team. Rodgers and LaFleur, they went and they basically took Mike McCarthy's offense and added the wide zone run game to it, right? Like, they basically ran McCarthy's offense the last 2 years more than Shanahan's in Green Bay. So when you look at all these adaptations, right, Shanahan was the one that kind of stuck to that scheme and stuck to that philosophical backbone, because I think he believes in it that way. And I think that's where, we came to a long tangent from where we originally were, which was your question, was this a shot at Shanahan? I think that in a lot of ways it was a shot at Shanahan. And do I look at it as a bad thing? No, I think that's kind of his style. He seems to be a control freak that wants everything to be a certain way because he feels like he's thought it out and envisioned it where it should be that way, right? Like, another great conversation when he explains his process to RG3, where he tells him to run a play, and he runs the play for Shanahan to show him the conviction that he has in every play he draws up, right? But that's Shanahan's thinking. I've put so much thought into this, so therefore you should follow this. And I'm not doubting the thought he puts into it. When you look at the detail of the Niners offense, like, Shanahan really has studied this. He knows it. He's put in an incredible amount of thought to create the masterpiece that is the Niners offense. It's just that he thinks so confidently that it's that way that he's already got conviction that this is how it should be. This is who we should be. Whereas I think his peers seem to be a little more adaptable with, hey, this is what we have. Let's create an offense for that.
There's a lot of narcissism that shows through with Shanahan and this whole thing. Really, Shanahan, with all of them,
McVay, and McDaniel, for sure, all three,
for sure, no doubt about it. But it's funny because I remember as I was listening to that today. So first of all, you're right. Everything that Saleh did was to stop Shanahan's offense, because Shanahan basically thinks, well, if you can stop my offense, you can stop any offense. Like, that's where he's at mentally, which, hey, more power to you. I would figure out how to stop maybe Andy Reid's offense, but sure, if you think it's your offense, then stop your offense, I guess. But when RG3 was talking about that, so you're right, he goes into a deal where Shanahan tells RG3, hey, give me a play that you ran in college that you really like. We're going to install it in the offense. And so at this point, when I hear this, I'm like, all right, Shanahan, this is what I'm talking about. Like, these are the things that we've been waiting for. Like, are you giving your players this creativity, freedom to where they can install things like you're seeing Andy Reid do with Patrick Mahomes and some of the guys on the team? Or are you just holding everything at your chest and running it how you want it? And so when this story starts to unfold, I'm like, all right, Shanahan, here we go. This is what I'm talking about. And then as the story goes through, you realize that the only reason he gave the autonomy to RG3 to run this play was so that he could prove a point that he loves all of his plays as much as RG3 loves this one play. It's like, oh my gosh, dude, you're so full of yourself. This is crazy. Absolutely crazy. That one made me laugh pretty good.
Yeah, 100%. And I thought even the tidbit from McVay last year, thought it was humbling that McVay at one point looked at himself and looked at the intensity and the wear and tear he has on people and gave up play calling. And I thought Jordan Rodriguez was very sensitive and empathetic to McVay on how she covered that portion, but she was also fair about actually covering it and talking about the mental struggles. And I thought she was cognizant in depicting to us how important calling plays was to McVay and how low things must have gotten for him to look at himself and make a decision and give that up. I'm sorry. It's just the way I'm wired to think because I'm so invested in watching this team. My first thought was, would Shanahan reach that point? And I don't think Shanahan would reach a self-inflection point where he thinks that somebody else calling the plays would have the solution. I think he would be of the mindset that his play calling with the team. Now, in some ways, I admire his conviction there. As John Lynch says, they're very convicted. Like you have to admire that, right? Like you have to admire his self-belief. But in some ways, I think we got glimpses to see what is the little things that Shanahan is missing on why the Niners haven't gotten over the hump in the last 7 years, despite us viewing Shanahan as this extremely talented coach and a guy that we view within the top 5-6 coaches of football and a guy who's achieved so much. Why has he not achieved the ultimate pinnacle? I thought we got some glimpses into why.
Yeah, it is interesting. And not that I ever want Kyle to give up play calling and play designing. I think those are the reasons that he's here. And those are the things that he does very well. But one thing that I took away also is that every coach, as narcissistic as they all are, every coach, and maybe again, I haven't listened to the whole thing. There's still a little bit that I haven't heard. And so maybe it comes through. But every coach at some point during this 5-series episode talks about the people, the players as people and not as robots or schemes or anything like that.
Or the quarterback.
Or whatever. Shanahan never does that or not that I've heard yet. I don't hear him speaking about players like they are people and not a part of his scheme. It's all about his scheme, how good it is,
and what they could have, how they used the given available personnel. Yeah, that's how he speaks the entire podcast, right?
Yep.
McVay has moments where he's like, well, we had moments where Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp just did things for us. And McDaniel has moments where, when we have Tyreek Hill, right? And LaFleur has moments where it's like when we have Rodgers, and Shanahan's like, well, when we had a quarterback that was faster than anybody, well, my scheme, it's unstoppable. Like nobody can stop that. So it's 100% there. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I don't want to make this sound like the podcast is critical of Shanahan.
Yeah.
Because it's not. It's actually positive. And I think it does highlight so many of the things Shanahan does well. And there's so many things he does well, right? He's an innovator. He is a football philosopher. He is like just an absolute genius when it comes to the X's and O's of understanding defense and understanding offense. Like all of those things exist. But there's always just this element of he does have a sense of pride to his scheme that may get in the way of certain things. And in fact, even when we're talking about the wide 9 adjustment, I think that some of that narcissism, while we're levying out, hey, narcissism exists with McDaniel, right? McDaniel was quoted in that saying, hey, I gave more to the Washington offense than Sean and Matt, right? He says that directly. The adjustment that they had to how Dallas was playing the read option, he says, I was the one who made that adjustment. Like everybody was like, oh, how are we going to do this? I did that, right? McDaniel says, I don't feel pressure, right? I saw guys hemorrhaging. Like, for example, when he talked about the hemorrhaging, I thought he was directly taking shots at Matt LaFleur and Kyle Shanahan. There were a bunch of other people on that staff. But why did he say people were hemorrhaging before the Super Bowl? To me, that's what it felt like. And he said, I didn't feel any pressure in that moment, right? Then McVay talks about their adjustment to the wide 9 and how they figured it out against Detroit because he turned on Rashad Penny and studied him before the draft and realized that if you run a jet motion and wide zone to the same point, the linebacker is going to overrun the fit by overrunning to stop the jet motion, and you have the cutback, right, for the running back. And they run that play against Detroit week 2. Matt Breida runs for like an 80-yard touchdown. He says the exact play. He says he saw it with Rashad Penny. It's like McDaniel is full of it. just as much as Shanahan, right? He's every bit as full of it. And it was almost like his opportunity to finally take credit for all these things that he feels like somebody else has gotten credit for until now. And he might have taken it too much. So I want to be fair when we talk about Shanahan in all of this, because, there was a level of narcissism that was crazy from McDaniel and from McVay as well. LaFleur was kind of the only one that was not so full of himself throughout the podcast.
Yeah. I am going to bring up one last thing because I think we can tie this back to the 49ers in particular and the quarterback injuries that the 49ers have had. Whether you want to say it's on Shanahan or not, we can talk about the RG3 thing because there was a lot of speculation on what actually happened, and RG3 is on the podcast as well. And he talks about the injury and that whole situation. And when he hurt himself, I believe it was against Baltimore, he had sprained his LCL. And Mike Shanahan, not Kyle, so let's be clear, Mike Shanahan tells the media that, everything was fine. They had basically talked to the doctors. They had gotten all this medical approval and clearance for him to play again. And Dr. Andrews said that wasn't true. They never even talked to him. They never even asked him his opinion. And if it were up to him, he would have never cleared RG3 to ever play that as early as he was playing again. And RG3 talked about, of course, as a young player, he felt like he had a lot that he should do for his teammates. He talked about some of the older players like Santana Moss and London Fletcher, that he really felt like he owed it to those players to be back on the field. And he was going to do anything he could to play because he knew that him playing was their best chance to win, even if it meant furthering the injury. And one thing that he said at the very end of that was, sometimes players need to be protected because they're not going to always protect themselves. And he wishes somebody would have protected him in that situation. And I thought that was an interesting insight to basically, and that's a reflection of the whole coaching staff. And we can even fast forward and talk about potentially McDaniels and the Tua situation this year. How does that tie together? And just overall how this regime might look at players in the quarterback position and willing to put players out there before maybe they're ready to play.
No, 100%. I think that's a much deeper conversation. And, we did have the dispute where it was alleged reports, right, that Niners were upset with Jimmy Garoppolo not playing through the sprained ankle in 2020. There was people from the Athletics saying Jimmy Garoppolo, the Niners were upset that he didn't play and suit up for the NFC Championship game, and he just took a roster spot throughout the end of the year and prevented them from getting an extra defensive tackle in Hassan Ridgeway, who might have helped. The Niners defensive line got pushed around a little bit in that game. So I think both of those things, are 100% valid and things that we definitely need to discuss. I don't want to shift the topic one last time, but there was one more thing I thought as we go in here to RG3 that I found interesting. And I don't, this is not my point originally. This point is actually from, shout out to him, the coach. The coach, everybody knows the coach.
Oh yeah. We talk on a pretty regular basis. Yeah.
Right. So he's fantastic. And he kind of introduced me to this concept. And I think it does come into the RG3 situation because I think even when we get into that injury, I think there was a difference of opinions on how the people within the podcast looked at it, right? Like RG3 looks at the injury and he says, that's the one impediment in my career. I was going to be a great player. I got hurt. I needed someone to protect me from me. They didn't protect me. That's why I'm not a great player. Mm-hmm. And it didn't feel like his coaches, the other four guys talking in the podcast, had this cut and dry opinion that they just lost a star quarterback to injury. They felt more enamored with how they found a way to utilize that quarterback skill set within their offense. So to the RG3 point, I think where it gets deeper, and this is where the coach's point comes in. The coach's point was that, well, when you're talking about them and within the scheme, did they really equip RG3 with better tools to become, and I see this conversation a lot, and this is why I want to bring it up, this developing versus you utilizing the best skill set of a quarterback. In a lot of ways, both of those two things are the same. In a lot of ways, both of those two things are different. I see a lot of people present this argument, but they never understand the actual argument, and they present the worst examples of this argument. Where this argument comes into question when we have such an in-depth example of what's going on in this scheme is with RG3. The way they used him was the best way to use RG3, but it didn't give RG3 long-term weapons to be able to evolve his skill set to the point where we don't have to do this same thing with you, right? Like, their adjustments to what teams would have done wouldn't have been making RG3 better in these areas. It would have been, let's adjust our scheme and do these two things different. Let's block this play a little bit different. And that's how we'll deal with the adjustments to RG3's skill set. And so in some ways, that's why I think there is a little bit of skepticism from them on RG3 overall, whether he was injured or not, because they felt like they found a schematical advantage to take advantage of his uber physical traits rather than he was a quarterback and they had this process that he could play within the system and therefore really prop him up where, hey, when he gets injured and he tears his ACL and now his dad's coming to Dan Snyder and saying he doesn't want to run, well, we can go to him being able to do these things. Well, no, they never developed him doing those things. They just, they talked about it. They ran drift. What did he say? They ran it 260 something times that year, and they ran it for that reward. Like, sure, you're running one play, you're creating clever looks, you're finding ways to win with that. But the long-term process for the quarterback at that point, what was the evolution of his skill set? Now, it's, a very deep conversation that we have limited information to, but I thought that was kind of the deepest point to me with the RG3. Sure, the injuries is one level to it, and that's a level that we can talk about the coaching staff, but then the medicals, the owners, there's so many other people that factor into it, but directly tied into scheme and how they're utilizing quarterbacks and how they kind of, especially Shanahan, seems to view the quarterback as just another cog in his scheme rather than the guy the scheme is built around. He's a guy that needs to execute certain things to make the scheme operate a certain way. I know I'm, again, being very reductionist because it's not like he actually literally says these things. It's just the vibe you get from when he describes his scheme. He's talking about his scheme, so he has to describe the quarterback that way too. But when he talks about that, but yeah, I that was one thing I found very interesting because, in some ways I'm a skeptic of whether the RG3 carryover, like let's say he doesn't get hurt, like I still think there would have been certain adjustments to that. And I think their adjustments were schematical rather than, hey, we have made this quarterback and we've taken his skill set where, first year he couldn't play from the pocket, but year 3, he's so good from the pocket that if you try to defend us this way, we'll just go and be a normal drop back pass team. And we'll really get into our offense. I don't think Shanahan wants to exist in that area, which I think the other coaches in his tree have made the adjustment to exist in that area. And then 2, I think that they just want to utilize a quarterback skill set to do that. And I think it ties a lot into Trey Lance and what they looked for and why they might have thought they could have gotten him on the field earlier probably than he did, because while he was lacking in so many different areas in terms of drop back and all of this, he had experience being able to run and have a run game built off of have a pass game built off of the run game and be able to play in this play action offense and do the under center stuff and have that footwork and timing, have muscle memory there. Like, I understand it now. It was less about, well, he's going to have all of these things later. It's he has these things now that we can use and create an offense just around that.
Well, and this doesn't come up in the podcast, but we know that to be true because remember, RG3 and Mike Shanahan had a difference of opinion going into that second. I think it was the second year where he was like, hey, I believe I can play from the pocket.
He wanted to be Peyton Manning.
Yeah. And they said, no, you can't play from the pocket. You can't win from the pocket. We need you to do these other things. And so there was a clear difference.
Plays well. When he has that PCL injury, the sprained at PCL, Kirk Cousins comes in and plays well.
Yep.
And that was one thing they didn't cover in the podcast, but he does come in and play pretty well. And according to Mike Shanahan, I heard him in a different interview that kind of messed with RG3's head.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, totally understandable. Remember, they're the ones that drafted in the same draft. 2 rounds later, they drafted Kirk Cousins. So how can that not mess with a young quarterback's head?
Can we go there? That's the perfect segue to Do you remember the part where Kyle is like talking about how Mike used to get on him about calling Hail Marys because it messes with the quarterback's psychology? So
Oh
now he
yeah.
doesn't call Hail Marys. Like,
Yeah.
dude, is there a person in the NFL that is more arrogant about not caring about the quarterback's psychology than Kyle Shanahan? I
Yeah.
mean, he put his fucking quarterback through the ringer before they played the Super Bowl. If he
Yeah.
gets him to 15 throws, I promise nobody ever talks about Jimmy Garoppolo and the 8 throws Bob Greasy stuff. If he got him to 15 in that game, which he very easily could have, if he gets him to 15 in that game, Jesse, nobody cares. And instead, he made him the laughingstock where he had to hear for 2 weeks before the biggest game of his career that, hey, if they lose, it's going to be because of you. And if they win, it's going to be because you didn't screw it up. And what did he ultimately do in the big game? He did what he does. He screwed it up. And so I thought it was very interesting to hear them talk about quarterback psychology and all of this when, Shanahan has had his quarterbacks just been kicked in the media the last 6 years, whether it's Garoppolo, whether it's Purdy, whether it's Lance, they all just take an absolute public beating, and Shanahan doesn't really take that or any parts of it.
It's funny because for years, I've been on the side of Jimmy Garoppolo wasn't a very good starting level quarterback. And one of the things that would always come up in an argument when you had these conversations or a debate when you had these conversations was inevitably we would get to the 8 passes in an NFC championship. And the argument for Jimmy Garoppolo was, well, I mean, they were running the ball well. Why would they throw it? And then the argument against was, well, he screwed it up in Minnesota. That's why they took the ball out of his hands. And so
Mentioned
there
in
was
this
always,
podcast, right?
there was always
Direct
that back and
quote.
forth. We got our answer. And it definitely was exactly what most of us always thought, which was he says it. He doesn't say Jimmy's name. He says the quarterback throws it directly in the chest of a defender in Minnesota. Yeah, the quarterback throws it into the chest of the linebacker. And from that point on, I had to figure out how many times can we run the ball and still win these games. And that's what led to an 8-pass game in the NFC Championship. So it was exactly because he didn't trust Jimmy Garoppolo. He said it right there on the podcast.
Right. And I mean, if you're Garoppolo, how embarrassing it is, right? Biggest moment of your career. You win the NFC Championship game. You got Hall of Famer Terry Bradshaw. Do you remember what was the first question he asked Garoppolo?
I don't remember.
Is your arm tired?
Oh,
right. It's a good joke. It's a good joke, and Garoppolo handled it the right way.
Of course he did.
I do think that there was an ego stain that happened there that could have been easily avoided. And I think that ego was to send a message. And I wonder if the psychology of that. Now, this is my personal opinion. Nobody's ever confirmed this. In fact, I have suggested this exact theory to players on the 2019 team who've told me that was bullshit. So they've told me, nah, Vish, you're just creating theories. Like, nah, this is excessive. So I'll say that. Like, they've told me that that's just a theory. But I do believe that at the end of the day, there is a psychology that plays into it, because instead of thinking of these people as, hey, this is how my team dynamic was when I played Park District, whatever sport at 8 years old and whatever, when we used to get orange peels after the games, which is how I think a lot of people
Capri
view
Suns.
this. I view it as reasonably, how would you feel if you're in a workplace with 53 other coworkers? And that's how I view the NFL in a lot of ways, because I think that's what it is. And in a workplace, if I was Jimmy Garoppolo and I was whatever the workplace equivalent of a quarterback was, and I had to deal with that embarrassment, it would mess with my psychology. It would mess with my confidence. Now, Jimmy seems to be unflappable in a way and nonchalant in a way that was negative, but also in a way that was positive, because he seemed to be able to deal with this. But, man.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we both kind of took away from the whole regime, and after listening through this, and again, never been the biggest fan of Jimmy as far as a player goes, but he certainly was put through the ringer, and I don't know if there was a better temperament that a quarterback could have going through some of the things that he really had to go through these last couple of years in San Francisco, no doubt about it.
I think so too. And in some ways, I wonder if they're going to miss that temperament, because I wonder if it gets to week 3, right, and Brock Purdy has to hear everything about Trey Lance. Like, we already saw that Trey Lance hearing about Jimmy Garoppolo fucked with Trey Lance. There's no doubt about that in my mind.
Yeah,
like will it fuck with Brock Purdy? And so these are some of the things that we need to see. The 49ers have shown they don't care really about your psychology. They don't care. They're saying tough it up, Buttercup. But in a lot of ways, I think Jimmy's ability to handle all of that and endure all of that and just keep coming back and being the same guy, I think that's what built him so much equity with his teammates. And I think that was an underrated aspect in all of this. I mean, we saw how Derek Carr how sensitive he was to trade conversation and stuff this year, right? Jimmy Garoppolo was being talked about traded the year after he went to the Super Bowl with the team.
From the guy that he was already backing up in New England. So, yeah. I mean, talk about a mind F. Yeah, you're right about that. And I think also coupling that podcast with the quarterback Netflix series that's happening right now, the biggest takeaway that I have, and I always knew it was there, but it's just another reminder that these are humans. Like they get paid a lot. They should be robots. None of that stuff should matter. You're a professional, blah, 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 blah. All of these players are people first, and they hear the noise. 100%. They have to go through the psychology just like anybody else. They have to deal with real life things just like anybody else. And so to act as if it's not something, to act as if these small things can't turn into mountains, these molehills can't turn into mountains in their mind and play with them in a poor way psychologically, I think is dismissing what is really happening and what really goes on in the minds of these people who happen to play quarterback in the NFL.
Right, absolutely. And I don't want to sound like I'm being sympathetic to Garoppolo either, because at the end of the day, I think the biggest issue was that he was just not a good enough quarterback. And sure. I think Shanahan was absolutely right in terms of creating or thinking that, right? Like there's no doubt about that in my mind. And I think that's first and foremost in all of this. Now, I do think that maybe psychology-wise, there were a few things that could have done to aid a guy who I think we all understood, hey, he's not the best quarterback. And I don't know if the Niners ever did anything to coddle him. And that's where even the McVay Goff, I used to make this comparison, but even during the Stafford time, right? Like McVay pretty much propped up Goff. You would never hear negativity surrounding Goff, but the first time you heard it, they got rid of Goff. Mm-hmm. You would always hear negativity surrounding Jimmy, but the Niners would never get off Jimmy. It was one of the weirdest dichotomies of all time, right?
Yeah, it is. It's super strange. I mean, you're right. The way that McVay talked about Goff was always in a glowing fashion. And
right. And we found out in this podcast that McVay was playing Madden with Robot Goff.
Right. Right, exactly. So he always talked very highly of him. And the moment that he stopped talking highly about him, he did trade him. And that's exactly the way that it should go. And the moment that the 49ers stopped talking highly, or Shanahan stopped talking highly about Jimmy, they just kept him around and kept him around. And then they found his replacement, and then they kept him around. And then they decided to start his replacement, yet they kept him around. It's like, man, the whole thing is super bizarre to me. Super bizarre still.
It's a one-of-one situation, man. Did anybody have money on Jimmy Garoppolo making it in San Francisco to 2023?
Oh, dude, I don't think so. We talked about it for 3 off seasons in a row that he wasn't coming back, and he came back every off season.
I've been doing content since week 2 of 2020. So the game Nick Bosa got injured against the Jets, that was the first time I ever did Mondays with Vish. Since then, we have been talking about Jimmy Garoppolo being done. Like since then. And he was finally done 3 years later.
That's crazy. That's crazy when you put it like that. Dang, you've really been going that long, huh? That's wild, because I didn't start till February 2021.
Yeah, same season. I started like 8 months before you, 6 months before you.
Well, yeah, but I started in the off season, right? Like right after that season it ended.
We were the Washington coaching staff over there.
We were the great. So is Grant Mike Shanahan, or is he Kyle Shanahan? Let's call him Kyle because he doesn't.
I kind of like him being Kyle.
I do too. It makes it
I
more fun.
really like him being Kyle.
Now we have to assign coaching names to every person that's ever been on the show. I think that would be a fun one to do for sure.
Yeah.
Mike Drops with Monza says, excellent way to explain Kyle's failures to develop Trey. Yeah, I don't know. It probably came out that way. I don't think that was necessarily what I was trying to say, but I think that it definitely gives insight as to what Kyle thinks potentially of the quarterback position. And Kyle often contradicts himself because, and you brought this up, Vish, but the last time we did a show together a couple weeks ago, you talked about how Kyle didn't want to take the 49ers job because he wanted an established quarterback that he could work with.
He's quoted saying that.
He's quoted as saying that.
That's
Yeah,
his quote,
absolutely.
yeah.
Basically, because he didn't want to go through the same things his dad went through. And he loves his dad and thinks his dad is a right. Post Elway thinks his dad is like the best coach ever and thought he got a raw deal. And so he didn't want to go through those things. And so he wanted an established quarterback. And that's why he was hesitant to take the 49ers position. Yet here we are going into year 7 and we still don't have a quarterback. And when you have a chance to have a quarterback, you don't necessarily go to that quarterback. So to me, it's a little contradictory. What he says and what he does seem to clash a little bit in my mind.
Yeah, I don't want to call it a failure to develop because the process of developing is still happening. And
for sure,
we can't close the door on that process yet. But like you mentioned, I think it's a great way to kind of get an idea of how Kyle views the entire picture. And I will say this also, right? I think too many people are looking for a conclusive, well, this is how he views it, so he's wrong, right? Or this is how he views it, and this is where he's wrong. But really, when we're talking about philosophically getting here with football, right? It's not less about right or wrong, and it's more about believing in a process, right? Like that's why certain teams believe in playing Tampa 2, right? They believe in being that defense. That's an identity. They have belief in it. And then you have Belichick who believes in being everything. Not saying one is right? Like a lot of teams have won championships playing Tampa 2, playing that Seattle cover 3. A lot of teams have won. Belichick himself has won a lot of championships. So it gets into a football process and a philosophy. And I think more so our goal was to just enlighten on, hey, we had this opportunity to hear more of what Kyle Shanahan thinks and why things might be a certain way because this is how he thinks. Not less about right or wrong. This is just how he thinks.
Yeah, no doubt about it. HR, what are you trying to say? That I have tons of upside and I'm improving this offseason? Is that where you're going with that comment? I'm curious.
I did hear completely unprovoked that you were working with, I don't know who's the podcast expert. Who is the Jeff Christensen in this analogy? But I heard you were working with him and you've made great strides. Like you're not the same guy anymore. Like the Jesse Naylor I saw, well, you were clean shaven. And then you had that goatee mustache look too. So technically, you aren't the same.
The mechanics have changed. I had a finger injury, made it really hard to podcast. And now I've worked through that. My podcasting mechanics have improved. I think I might break out this season, HR. You might be right about this.
I will say this, though. When you got hurt last year, I thought it was a great return to 49ers podcasting. Like, I thought that was 49ers podcasting. Like, it's back. We're back.
That's true. Yeah, you're right. It was actually, I had the eye surgery. And so when that happened, that was when I got hurt. I left the scene for like a week. And you're right. That's when 49er podcasting got returned.
Yeah, I called up Mike Silver. I was like, I'm not going to say that we're a better podcast group now, but you can say we're a better podcast group.
Oh, too funny. I love it. I absolutely love it. Well, Vish, listen, we went an hour 45. I want to say this. Training camp's just over a week away. I'm going to be there for 5 days, so make sure you stay tuned into Last Second Sports. And I'm not going to be all over Twitter talking about everything. Every thought I have, every little thing that I am learning from training camp is going straight to the YouTube channel. It's not going to Twitter and then the YouTube channel. It's all going to be here. So make sure you tune in. If you are watching on Last Second Sports, make sure you jump over to Vish's channel as soon as we are done. In fact, here, let's just make it easy. Hold on. I'm going to make it easy because
technology.
y'all, if I don't make it easy,
is this a YouTube video moment where I just like click on this and I point up to this?
No, it's not going to be that. I just wanted to put your name there so that they know what to look for. If you don't make it easy, people just don't show the love that they should. So make sure you are showing Vish love as well. And we have a couple more super chats. Actually, one more super chat on the way out. Gammon says, coverage, linebacker, tandem in history. Where do you rank Warner and Greenlaw? Oh, this is a really good question. I have them third behind 2020 Tampa and the 2012 Seahawks team.
Brian
Third
Urlacher
all
and
time.
Lance
That's
Briggs,
wow.
anybody?
I know. Lance Briggs, Urlacher.
That was Urlacher. I mean, when you're talking about the prototype linebacker to run the whole in Tampa too, that's Brian Urlacher, right? Like that's Fred Warner before Fred Warner. So.
I know. And I'll never forget the time that the Bears were playing the Falcons and Mike Vick had caught the edge and was running full speed. And Urlacher caught him from behind. That is when I knew that Urlacher was a different level athlete. I got to put that Bears unit ahead of him as well.
Same thing, by the way, for another group that could be in this conversation, Willis Bowman. Like Navarro Bowman, that week 4 in 2011 game at Philly, when he had multiple times where he just chases Mike Vick down on the sideline. Like that's when you know, like, holy cow, we're not just talking about a good player. We're talking about like one of those, freaky, like, hey, we haven't seen a guy like that before.
Yeah, I would also say that the cornerback group and really even the safety group that those two played with in San Francisco didn't have the best coverage skills. I mean,
Terrell Brown was a good player. Carlos Rogers was a good player. I mean, Culliver couldn't play the ball, but he could stay on receivers' hips.
Those safeties were hitters. They were the tone setters. Yeah. And I think that put a lot on Willis and Bowman to cover as well. So I think that's probably two more linebacking cores that I would put potentially above this one as well. So we'll see. It's still early. Greenlaw and Warner still have time. Like they're still young and developing together. This can improve.
Who played with Derek Brooks in
that's what I was trying to think of
Shelton
too.
Shelton Corliss?
Yeah, I think so.
Who was the one in 02 that played next to Derek Brooks? I know Corliss played a couple years back in the day.
I don't remember. I was thinking that too because Brooks was an absolute beast when it came to coverage. Who's next to him? You know what I mean? Like that's what makes it really hard.
And then if we get into it, Ray Lewis, Bart Scott.
Oh, that's
Bart
true.
Scott went to the Jets, was a decent duo with Rex Ryan, right?
Did Kuechly ever had a good running mate?
Yeah, Thomas Davis.
So. Davis. Tommy, you're right. Thomas Davis and Kuechly. Yeah, there you go.
They had a year where it was Beeson, Thomas Davis, and Kuechly.
Yeah.
Although
Thomas Davis was
a good year for Tampa Bay, also in between, if I remember correctly. In fact, I thought Deion Jones and Devondre Campbell, when we're just talking about pure coverage, they were two freaky guys that could run. They're definitely not in the conversation we're talking about. I think probably Bobby and KJ are the two best I've seen as a duo in coverage.
Ooh. Yeah. Yeah, Bobby, KJ. Fletcher ever have any good running mates that we could throw in there?
Oh,
can't think of any.
Shoot. That's a good name.
Lennon Fletcher was really good, man.
Yeah.
He was really good.
I think the issue is that we get like stuck with when we throw coverage into it as Gaiman is thrown into it. Like a lot of these great duos were just, your prototypical like downhill hitters.
Yeah.
And so like it becomes difficult. For sure though, I think that, Brooks, and if it was Corliss at the time, then that's for sure I would put there. And then, the 2012 Seahawks were, man.
So, I mean, maybe top 5-ish or approaching top 5, but there's been some good ones. You definitely mentioned too.
Another linebacker that played in Baltimore. I'm forgetting the name with Ray Lewis. Not before Bart Scott. Bart Scott was kind of irrelevant in Baltimore.
Pretty
good player. Let me look him up.
Trying
A
to
lot of
think.
people
I
are
mean,
throwing
Suggs
in
was
like
the pass rusher.
right. I see mic drop with Monza says Peter Boulware. No.
Shoot, man, Pittsburgh had some good.
Pittsburgh, I mean, you could say James Ferrier and
That's what I'm saying. Suggs was the rusher. You're saying it's Boulware.
I think it might have been Peter Boulware. Did LeVar Arrington and London Fletcher play together in Washington for a little bit?
If they did, London Fletcher would have had to have been really old. So at that point, it would be tough to.
With LeVar Arrington?
I think so. Fletcher was hella old, man.
LeVar Arrington was drafted in 02, though, right?
Let's see. London Fletcher was born in 75.
The Peter Boulware one, if we're talking coverage, I'm not sure about that one. I from what I know
never
now,
mind. You're right.
alive. I wasn't alive at the time, but from what I know, Peter Boulware was a pass rusher, right, from Florida State. It was like the 4th or 5th pick in the draft.
Oh, you're right. I'm tripping. They're only a few years apart. I don't know why I thought London Fletcher was much older.
Am I tripping about Boulware too? Is Mike drops with Monza right? I know it's a little bit before my time, but
no, that was a good. He's right. I think he might be right.
If we're talking coverage, right?
Pure coverage. No, I get it. I get it.
Pass rusher.
No, you're right. You're right.
From Florida State.
It was a good tandem, but I don't know if I can say
that's like
pure
saying
pass
Lewis
rusher.
and Suggs is a tandem, right?
I also don't think. I mean, we were talking about London Fletcher and LeVar Arrington. I don't think I could put them in there either, just because LeVar was. I mean, he wrecked games near the line of scrimmage. I feel like more than anything.
Yeah, I wouldn't put them in the conversation with some of the guys Gaiman mentioned earlier. But
Jamie Sharper. That's who you're looking for. That's who you're looking for. Yes. Yeah, there you go. That's who you're looking. Thank you. See, chat always coming through. Ooh, Vontez Burfict and Ray Maualuga. Burfict was more.
Brown doesn't remember.
Oh God. Speaking of, Brian, actually, let's hold on. I want to talk about this real quick. I was about to get out of here, but you reminded me. Now I have to talk about it.
Okay.
So DK Metcalf in his top 5 receivers doesn't put Jerry Rice number 1, puts Antonio Brown number 1, and had Jerry Rice, I think, number 4 behind Terrell Owens and Randy Moss. I think we're 2 and 3, and then Jerry Rice was number 4. So we know that list is crazy, but it does remind me, and I made this argument a couple years ago. Antonio Brown might have had the best 6-year stretch ever for a receiver, right? Like, I'm not tripping on that.
Non-Jerry Rice 6-year stretch, yeah, I think so.
Even Jerry Rice 6-year stretch.
It's comparable to Jerry. I think Jerry probably edges him out because there's multiple 6-year stretches that Jerry has that put him right around that conversation.
Yeah.
But I like, you can take 6 years at like a consecutive point at like 3 different spots in Jerry's career, and it's like, that's great 6 years. But yeah, I think people don't really remember how crazy that production was. This is one of the most. I'll never forget it. Right, the best example is 2016. They go to Denver. And that was the no-fly zone Denver defense. And I watched that game live. It was on CBS. And they said Chris Harris on broadcast because that was Chris Harris, Aqib Talib, TJ Ward, and Darian Stewart. That was their secondary. And I'll never forget this. Chris Harris Jr. had not given up a touchdown in 2 years. And Antonio Brown and them, they went into Denver, and Antonio Brown put 10 for 120 and 2 touchdowns on his head.
Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. Clarzard says Clay Matthews, AJ Hawk. Clay Matthews was the pass rusher, though. So
maybe Desmond Bishop, AJ Hawk, they were a decent duo. Desmond Bishop was the better player of the two. But yeah.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Okay, this is a good question.
Like, if we go that pass rusher when people were saying, like, oh, Peter Bowl, like, then we could say, like, Ray Lewis Suggs is like a duo.
Yeah.
That's 2 Hall of Famers, right? Yeah.
Who would you rather have, Bowman and Willis, Fred and Dre? I'll take Bowman and Willis, man.
I'll take Bowman and Willis. I think Willis might be the best individual athlete we've ever seen at the position. And so when we're in that conversation, I think I think Warner and Bowman are great players, and I think Drake Greenlaw is a very good one. I think Willis is one of those, like, hey, when we say Calvin Johnson for receivers, hey, when we say Adrian Peterson for running back, hey, we should probably mention Patrick Willis for linebackers too.
If Patrick Willis had played 4 more full seasons, I think a lot of people would talk about him the way that talk about Ray Lewis. He's that good, I think. I really believe that.
Yeah, I agree.
He's absolutely incredible. So I would have to go there. Great question.
Especially a young Patrick Willis. Like, I think people, because the Niners became good when his body started giving out a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think people kind of remember that. But, like, do you remember, like, 2007, 2008 when he came in? He was the fastest player on the field, and he played linebacker.
There was a while there where the linebackers in the NFL were so good, and it was like him and everybody else for a couple seasons. That's how good
there was a couple seasons, right? Like I mentioned him earlier. Curtis Lofton had a couple good years in Atlanta in that stretch. John Beeson had a couple good years in Carolina in that stretch. Like Ray Malaluga, Brian Cushing. There were a few guys that had a couple good seasons in that stretch. It was like Patrick Willis was like, oh my God. Like, dude, I'll never forget. Like, there was a year the All-Pro team. I think it was either 08 or 09. I think Willis got 48 out of 50 votes, and then I think the only unanimous player on that was Revis. And that was like 09 Revis, who made Chad Johnson change his name. Right? Yeah. Like,
yeah, that Revis. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And like Willis was like individually as dominant in his position as a player that was doing things at corner that we were saying, like, that's Deion Sanders level. And Deion Sanders is, one of those guys in the conversation for the greatest athletes we've ever seen. So,
yeah, no doubt about it. All right, we're getting out of here for real this time. Appreciate you, Vish, for making this happen. I know we started a little bit late. During the season, Vish, Larry, and I are going to be like a traveling podcast. So every Thursday, we're either going to be on this channel, Vish's channel, or Larry's channel, and we're going to rotate through. So you're going to get a lot more of Vish here on Last Second Sports, a lot more of me on Vish's channel. Your chat doesn't seem to like me as much as my chat likes you, but you're going to see me regardless.
I haven't really seen my chat even blowing up. I will say this to all the, loyal supporters I have. First of all, I appreciate all of you, like, subscribe, Make sure you're liking and subscribing to Jessie as well. But like, we might have, like, as a group, and I understand that I'm probably, if we're ranking like podcasters in terms of pure entertainment, I'm definitely down there. Like, I don't bring a lot of entertainment value here, but I would say that I'm disappointed in my chat also not bringing that entertainment value. Like, I see the chats of some of these other guys. Like, I see what kind of conversations coming in, what kind of content is going on in the chat. Like, you guys are your own individual show in some of these other places. So my chat, I'm going to need you to bring some spice.
Oh, they did today. I was putting up some of their comments. All it took was me to come in because they're not a fan of me, and so they got a little. It was good. It was good. I was putting their comments up.
Come on, chat. We like Jessie.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I don't mind it. I mean, as long as you're not indifferent about me, I don't care.
I do mind it. Stop hating on me, guys. It hurts my feelings. No, I'm joking.
Don't be indifferent. Either like me or hate me, but don't be indifferent. And as long as that's happening, then I'm doing my job. So appreciate y'all. Have a blessed night. Talk to you later. Peace.